Right now, all I see is a man getting real defensive over a simple conversation, almost like he's got something to hide.
I've got nothing to hide, officer. And I think it's time you both got back in your truck.
You think you get to tell us when we leave?
Captain Wright clenched his jaw as Alvin stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated.
If you have a warrant, show it. If you have a charge, state it. Otherwise, I'd like you to leave my property.
Guys like you always think you can talk your way out of things.
Captain Wright had no idea the next sound he heard would be Alvin's highly trained dogs racing to protect their commander. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The sky was still gray when Alvin Arman walked out to check his fence line. Morning fog sat low over the fields, and his boots left dark tracks in the wet grass. He held a cup of coffee in one hand, steam curling up into the cold air. This was his favorite part of the day. Quiet. Just him, his land, and the sound of cattle waking up in the far pasture. He had walked this same path for 30 years. His father had walked it before him. The fence posts were old, some of them leaning, but they were his. Every inch of this farm was his. That's when he heard the truck. Tires crunched on the gravel road that ran along his property. Alvin turned and saw a police cruiser slow down, then stop right at his gate. 2 officers stepped out. The first one was tall, with a hard jaw and cold eyes. His badge read, Captain R. Wright. Behind him came a younger officer, thick in the shoulders, who moved with the kind of swagger that made Alvin's stomach tighten. His name tag said Hambrick. "Morning," Wright said, though his voice held no warmth at all. Alvin nodded slowly. "Morning. Something I can help you with, officer?" "Captain," Wright corrected him, sharp as a slap. "And yeah, got a noise complaint. Somebody said there's a disturbance out here early mornings. Animals, maybe. Machinery." Alvin frowned. He looked around at his quiet field, the mist still hanging over the grass, not a single sound except birds waking up. A noise complaint? Out here? Ain't another house for a mile in any direction. "That's what we're here to find out," Hambrick said, stepping past the gate without asking. His boots crushed the tall grass along Alvin's fence line like it didn't belong to anybody. "Hold on now." Alvin set his coffee down on a fence post. "That's my property. I'd appreciate it if you asked before you go walking on it." Hambrick turned back, a slow grin creeping across his face. "You'd appreciate it? That's cute." He looked at Wright and laughed, like Alvin had told a joke. "This land's got a lot of value, Captain. Prime real estate, don't you think?" Wright didn't answer him. His eyes stayed locked on Alvin, studying him the way a man studies something he's already decided to get rid of. "I don't know what this is really about," Alvin said, keeping his voice steady. "But I haven't broken any laws. I've lived here my whole life. Never had a complaint filed against me. Not once." "That's not what our records show," Wright said. Alvin's jaw tightened. "Excuse me? We've got a file on you," Wright said, tapping the side of his head like the words lived there instead of on paper. "Says you've had issues before. Neighbors uneasy. Property concerns." "That's a lie." The words came out sharper than Alvin meant them to, but he didn't take them back. "There's no file. There's no neighbors complaining. I don't know what game you two are playing, but I built this farm with my own 2 hands, and I'm not about to stand here and let you make up stories about me." Hambrick stepped closer, close enough that Alvin could smell coffee on his breath. "Watch your tone, old man." "I'm being respectful," Alvin said. "I'd just like the same in return." Wright's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Respect gets earned, Arman. Right now, all I see is a man getting real defensive over a simple conversation. Almost like he's got something to hide." "I've got nothing to hide," Alvin said. "This is my land. My family's land. And I think it's time you both got back in your truck. Wright laughed, short and cold. You think you get to tell us when we leave? The air between them went tight, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Alvin stood his ground, his hands steady at his sides, even as his heart pounded hard against his ribs. Wright finally turned back toward the cruiser, but he stopped at the door and looked back over his shoulder. This isn't over. Consider this us getting to know each other, Armand. There'll be more visits. The truck didn't leave right away. It just sat there, idling at the gate, engine humming low, watching Alvin as he turned and walked back toward the barn. He could feel their eyes on his back the whole way. Something told him this was only the beginning. Alvin didn't get far. He'd made it maybe 20 yards toward the barn when he heard the truck doors slam behind him. He turned and saw Wright and Hambrick walking fast, cutting across his field instead of driving away like he thought they would. His stomach dropped. This wasn't over. Not even close. "Armand!" Wright called out. "Hold up a second." Alvin stopped near the tree line at the edge of his east pasture, the old oaks standing tall and silent around him. He turned to face them, keeping his voice calm even though his pulse was starting to race. "Thought you said you were leaving." "Changed my mind," Wright said. "You know how that goes." Hambrick walked in a slow half-circle, boxing Alvin in against the fence without even trying to hide it. "You were awful quick to get smart with us back there," he said. "Guys like you always think you can talk your way out of things." "Guys like me?" Alvin felt heat rise in his chest. "What's that supposed to mean?" Hambrick shrugged, all fake innocence. "Just an observation." "No," Alvin said. "Say what you mean." Wright stepped in close, his voice dropping low and hard. "What he means is, we've dealt with your kind before. Always got an excuse, always got a story. But the file don't lie, Armand." "There is no file," Alvin said, his voice rising now despite himself. "You're making that up, and we both know it." "You calling me a liar?" Wright's face twisted, all pretense of politeness gone. "I'm calling it like I see it." "That's resisting," Hambrick snapped, way too fast, way too eager. "You hear that, Captain? Man's resisting." "I haven't done a damn thing," Alvin said, his hands rising instinctively, palms open. "I'm standing still. I'm not resisting anything." "Doesn't matter what you did," Wright said. "Matters what we say you did." The words hit Alvin like a fist to the gut. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some mix-up that would sort itself out with a calm conversation. These men had already decided who he was before they ever pulled up to his gate. And now they were closing in, boxing him against his own fence line like he was some kind of animal. "You've got no warrant," Alvin said. "No reason to be on my land. No reason to touch me." "We don't need a reason," Hambrick said, grinning now, the kind of grin that made Alvin's skin crawl. "We're the police." Hambrick's hand drifted toward his belt, toward the cuffs hanging there. "Turn around," Wright ordered. "Hands behind your back." "For what?" Alvin's voice cracked, not from fear, but from fury. 30 years on this land, and it had come to this. Two men who'd never once introduced themselves properly, ready to drag him off his own property over lies they'd invented that morning. "Turn around," Wright said again, sharper this time. Alvin's mind raced. He thought about Danny, about what she'd say if she saw this. He thought about his father, who'd built this farm from nothing, who told him 100 times that this land was the one thing nobody could ever take from him. Hambrick reached out and grabbed Alvin's wrist, yanking it hard toward his back. Alvin gritted his teeth and refused to move his other arm. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't make this harder than it's gotta be," Wright warned, stepping in closer, his hand hovering near his hip. Hambrick's fingers tightened around the cuffs, cold metal brushing against Alvin's skin. That's when the growl came. Low, Deep, close. Every man froze. Alvin's heart lurched as he recognized the sound instantly, a sound he hadn't heard outside of training fields and battlefields in years. He knew that growl. He'd trained that growl. Hambrick's grip on his wrist loosened instantly, his head snapping toward the tree line behind Alvin. "What in the hell?" Wright muttered, taking a step back, his hand finally moving to his holster. Branches rustled. Leaves shook. And from the shadows of the oak trees, two dark shapes came tearing out at a dead sprint, teeth bared, eyes locked on the men standing over Alvin. They moved like they'd been shot out of a cannon. Two German shepherds, dark and powerful, tore across the grass and planted themselves on either side of Alvin. Teeth bared, bodies low and coiled tight like springs ready to snap. Their growls rumbled deep in their chests, steady and controlled, the kind of sound that promised violence without a single wasted motion. Hambrick stumbled backward so fast he nearly fell into the fence. His hand shot up in front of him like that could stop 100 pounds of muscle and teeth. "Whoa! Whoa! Back! Get back!" Wright froze completely, his hand hovering an inch from his holster, sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Don't move," he said, though it wasn't clear if he was talking to the dogs or to himself. Alvin stood perfectly still between them, and for the first time since the truck had rolled up to his gate, something like calm settled over him. He didn't need to look down to know it was Titus on his left and Nova on his right. He knew their weight, their stance, the exact rhythm of their breathing when they were locked in and ready. "Easy," Alvin said quietly, and the dogs' growls dropped half a notch, though their eyes never left the two officers. They didn't lunge. They didn't bark wildly like untrained animals might. They held their position, disciplined and terrifying all at once, waiting for a single word. "What in the hell are those?" Hambrick's voice cracked, all his earlier swagger gone. Wright's eyes narrowed, studying the dogs with something between fear and disbelief. "Those aren't farm dogs," he said slowly. "Those are trained." "That's right," Alvin said. "Where'd a farmer get dogs like that?" Wright demanded, though his voice had lost its edge of command. It was quieter now. Careful. Alvin straightened his shoulders. "I wasn't always a farmer, Captain." Wright's eyes flicked to him, waiting. 12 years in the Army," Alvin said. "K-9 handler. 2 tours overseas. Titus and Nova aren't pets. They're retired military working dogs, trained to detect threats and protect their handler. Me." He let that sink in for a second. "So, when you two came at me the way you did, hands reaching, voices raised, they knew exactly what that meant. They're not confused right now. They know what you were about to do." Hambrick swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the dogs like he expected them to lunge any second. "This ain't right. You can't just have attack dogs out here." "They're not attack dogs," Alvin cut in, his voice hardening. "They're protection trained, and everything they know, I taught them, on a government base, with government paperwork to prove it. You want to see their service records? I've got them in the house. Vet clearance, too. Every shot, every certification, all filed proper with the county." He paused. "Which is more than I can say for whatever file you claim you've got on me." Wright's jaw tightened. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but recalculation. Like a man realizing the game he thought he was playing had suddenly changed shape. "This isn't finished," Wright said, but his voice had lost its weight. He took a slow step back, careful not to make any sudden movement toward the dogs. "Sure looks finished to me," Alvin said. Hambrick looked at his captain, waiting for direction, still pale. "Get in the truck," Wright muttered. Hambrick didn't need telling twice. He backed away fast, nearly tripping over the fence post as he scrambled toward the cruiser. Wright lingered a moment longer, His eyes locked on Alvin like he was trying to memorize his face. "You think this changes anything," he said. "It doesn't. There's more coming than just us." Alvin didn't answer. He just kept his hand resting gently on Titus's head, feeling the dog's muscles still coiled tight beneath his fur. Wright turned and walked away, boots crunching hard against the gravel, and a moment later, the cruiser's engine roared to life. Tires spun briefly in the dirt before the truck peeled off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust behind it. Alvin let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He knelt down between his dogs, running a hand over each of their heads, feeling the tension slowly drain from their bodies. "Good job," he whispered. "Good job, both of you." But even as the fear drained out of him, one thought settled cold and heavy in his chest. Wright wasn't done. Not even close. By the time the sun climbed high over the fields, Alvin had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit around and wait for Wright to make good on his threat. He loaded Titus and Nova into the back of his truck and drove into town, the morning's confrontation replaying over and over in his head with every mile. The sheriff's office sat on Main Street, a squat brick building with a flag hanging limp in the windless afternoon. Alvin parked out front, cracked the windows for the dogs, and told them to stay before heading inside. The woman behind the front desk led him back to an office where Sheriff Ivory Marsh sat behind a cluttered desk, reading glasses pushed up into her graying hair. She looked up when Alvin knocked on the doorframe. "Mr. Arman," she said, standing to shake his hand. "What can I do for you?" Alvin sat down across from her and laid it all out. The truck at his gate, the made-up noise complaint, the claim about a file that didn't exist, Hambrick's hand on his wrist, the cuffs. He kept his voice steady, but his hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists more than once as he spoke. Marsh listened without interrupting, her expression darkening with every detail. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "This isn't the first time I've heard something like this about Wright's precinct." Alvin's eyebrows rose. "It's happened before?" "Nothing formal. Whispers, mostly. A complaint here, a complaint there, never enough for anybody to act on." She shook her head. "But what you're describing, a fabricated file, an unprovoked confrontation, that's different. That's serious. So what happens now?" "I'm going to log this as an official report," Marsh said, already reaching for a form. "I'll pull whatever record they claim to have on you and compare it against county filing dates. If there's a discrepancy, if that file was created after the fact, that's not just harassment. That's a paper trail somebody's going to have to answer for." Alvin felt something loosen in his chest, just slightly. It was the first bit of good news he'd had all day. "I appreciate you taking this seriously." "You should have been taken seriously the moment you walked in," Marsh said. "I can't promise you results overnight, but I promise you I'll look into it." They spoke a while longer, Marsh taking careful notes, asking about timestamps and badge numbers, about the dog's training records in case Wright tried to spin the story differently later. By the time Alvin stood to leave, the afternoon light had shifted long and gold through the office windows. He drove home with the windows down, the dogs' heads hanging out on either side, tongues flapping in the wind. For a little while, the tightness in his chest eased. Maybe the system would work the way it was supposed to. Maybe this would all get sorted out before it went any further. He pulled into his driveway just as the sun started sinking behind the tree line, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Oscar Rayburn was waiting by the fence that separated their two properties, leaning on a post with his arms crossed, a look on his face that told Alvin he'd already heard something. "Heard you had some trouble this morning," Oscar said as Alvin climbed out of the truck. "Word travels fast. Always does around here." Oscar's eyes followed Titus and Nova as they trotted past him toward the porch. "You all right?" Alvin rubbed the back of his neck. "I will be. Went and talked to Sheriff Marsh. She seemed like she's gonna actually do something about it. Oscar's expression didn't soften the way Alvin expected. If anything, it grew more serious. Alvin, I've known Roland Wright a long time. Longer than you have. That man doesn't let go of things. Not ever. Marsh seemed like she meant it, Oscar. I believe she does, Oscar said. I just don't think meaning it is gonna be enough. Alvin looked out at his fields, the light fading fast now, shadows stretching long across the grass. He didn't want to believe Oscar was right, but something in his gut told him the fight wasn't anywhere close to over. Alvin woke before the sun the next morning, the same way he always did. He pulled on his boots in the dark, grabbed his flashlight off the hook by the back door, and stepped outside to let Titus and Nova out for their morning run. The air was cold and still, mist clinging low to the grass just like it had the day before. The dogs took off toward the east field the way they always did, noses down, tails high. Alvin followed at his own pace, coffee in hand, half listening to the birds waking up in the trees. It was the same routine he'd followed for 30 years, except something was wrong. He noticed it before he understood what he was looking at. Small flashes of pink caught the beam of his flashlight, scattered across his east field in a straight, unnatural line. His stomach tightened as he walked closer, and the pink flashes became clear. Survey stakes. Dozens of them, driven into the ground with bright pink flagging tape tied to the top of each one, cutting a path straight through the middle of his property. What in the world? Alvin muttered, kneeling down beside the nearest stake. The wood was fresh, recently cut. Somebody had been out here in the night, measuring off his land like it already belonged to them. Titus and Nova circled the area, sniffing at the disturbed earth, ears pinned back with the same unease Alvin felt crawling up his spine. He followed the line of stakes across the field until he reached a wooden post near the county road, and that's when he saw it. A laminated notice, zip-tied to the post, flapping gently in the morning breeze. Alvin's hands weren't quite steady as he pulled it free and read it under the beam of his flashlight. Notice of Eminent Domain Review. Petition. His eyes moved fast over the dense legal language, catching pieces as his heart began to pound harder with every line. The petition had been filed by the county, backed by a development company called Parton Holdings. It cited documented nuisance complaints at his address, complaints Alvin had never once been notified about. It listed Wright's precinct as a supporting party, referencing police reports that validated the land's reclassification for public safety concerns. Alvin read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. This was never about noise. It had never been about some invented complaint from a neighbor who didn't exist. This was about his land. Somebody wanted him gone, and they were building a paper trail to make it look legal. He thought of Wright's parting words from the day before. This isn't finished. There's more coming than just us. Alvin's jaw clenched so tight it ached. 30 years he'd worked this land. His father had worked it before him, and his father before that. This farm wasn't just dirt and fences to him. It was the only thing in his life that had never once let him down. And now some company he'd never heard of, working hand in hand with a corrupt police captain, was trying to take it from him with lies typed up on official letterhead. He looked down at Titus and Nova, both of them sitting now, watching him with the kind of quiet patience only trained dogs could hold. "This isn't over," he told them, echoing Wright's own words back at the empty field. "Not by a long shot." Alvin folded the notice carefully and walked back toward the house, his mind racing faster than his boots could carry him. He needed help. Real help. Somebody who understood the law better than he did. Somebody who wouldn't back down the moment things got difficult. He walked straight into the kitchen, dropped the notice on the table, and picked up his phone before he'd even caught his breath. He dialed his daughter's number, his hand tightening around the phone as it rang. Danny picked up on the third ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Dad? It's early. Is everything?" "I need you to come home," Alvin said, cutting her off, his voice low and steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Alvin could hear her sitting up, the sleep already draining out of her voice. "What happened?" Alvin looked out the window at the pink stakes glowing faintly in the rising sun, cutting his land into pieces that weren't his anymore. "They're trying to take the farm." Danny Arman pulled into the driveway 2 days later, her car packed with a suitcase and a briefcase full of legal pads. She'd left the city before sunrise, calling her firm to explain she needed emergency leave without giving them many details. Some things mattered more than billable hours. Her father's voice on the phone, tight and controlled in that way she knew meant he was scared, was one of them. Alvin was waiting on the porch when she pulled up, Titus and Nova rising from their spots beside him to greet her car as it rolled to a stop. Danny barely had the door open before Titus trotted over, tail wagging despite the tension hanging thick in the morning air. "Dad." She hugged him tight, feeling how stiff his shoulders were, like he'd been carrying the weight of the last 2 days in his spine. "Show me everything." They walked out to the east field first. Danny crouched beside one of the survey stakes, running her fingers along the pink flagging tape, her lawyer's mind already working through angles before Alvin finished pointing out the boundary line the stakes had carved through his property. Back at the kitchen table, Alvin spread out the eminent domain notice, and Danny read it twice, her frown deepening with each pass. She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes, underlining phrases, circling dates. "This says the nuisance complaints go back 6 months, she said, tapping the paper. "Dad, you said Wright only showed up 2 days ago." "That's right." "So either these complaints existed before you two ever crossed paths, which makes no sense, or somebody backdated this filing to make it look older than it really is." She looked up at him. "That's not just harassment anymore. If I'm right, that's fraud." Alvin rubbed his hands over his face, exhaustion pulling at the corners of his eyes. "I don't care what you call it. I just want to know how we stop it." "We start by proving the paper trail is fake," Danny said. "I need to see the original complaint filings, the actual county records, not just what's summarized in this notice. If the dates don't line up, that's our first crack in their story." She opened her laptop and began searching public county filings, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard while Alvin watched, feeling more useless than he had in years. This was Danny's world, the world of depositions and filings and legal arguments, not his. His world was fences and cattle and dirt under his fingernails. But watching her work, watching the sharp focus in her eyes, he felt something steady settle in his chest for the first time since the stakes appeared in his field. "Dad," Danny said slowly, scrolling through a property database, "did you know Parton Holdings bought 3 other farms out this way in the last year?" Alvin leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. Sure enough, 3 parcels along the county line, all recently transferred to the same company name printed on his eminent domain notice. "The Henderson's place," Alvin said quietly, recognizing one of the addresses. "And the old Whitmore land. I didn't even know they'd sold." "Maybe they didn't have a choice," Danny said, her voice grim. "This isn't random, Dad. This looks like a pattern." They spent the rest of the afternoon combing through what records were publicly available, piecing together a timeline that felt less like a coincidence and more like a plan. By the time evening came, the kitchen table was buried under printed pages, sticky notes, and empty coffee cups. Alvin finally sat back, his eyes tired but sharper than they'd been in days. "What's our next step?" "Tomorrow morning, I go to the county clerk's office," Danny said. "I want the original filing records, the actual paperwork, not summaries. If somebody altered dates or slipped in fake complaints, There should be a record of it somewhere, even if they tried to cover their tracks. Alvin nodded slowly. Outside, the sun had dropped low behind the barn, painting the sky in soft shades of orange, fading into purple. Titus and Nova lay near the porch steps, ears perked, alert even in their rest, as if they too understood something was still circling the farm, waiting. Father and daughter sat together in the lamplight a while longer. The papers between them a battle map neither of them had asked to draw. But as tired as Alvin felt, he wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time since the stakes went into the ground, that felt like enough to keep fighting. The county clerk's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. Danny arrived right when it opened, a folder of notes tucked under her arm, ready to request every original document tied to her father's property. She approached the front counter, where a woman in her 50s sat typing slowly at an outdated computer, a nameplate reading Hannah Barson propped beside her keyboard. "Good morning," Danny said, offering a polite smile. "I'm looking for the original complaint filings associated with a property, an eminent domain petition filed against Alvin Arman." Hannah's typing stopped. Just for a second, but Danny noticed it. The kind of pause a person makes when a name lands somewhere it shouldn't. "Let me see what I can pull up," Hannah said, her voice a little too careful, a little too smooth. She disappeared into the back for several minutes, long enough that Danny began wondering if she'd been forgotten. When Hannah finally returned, she was carrying a thin folder, her hands trembling slightly as she set it on the counter. "This is everything on file," Hannah said. Danny opened the folder and scanned through it quickly. The dates matched the notice almost exactly, complaints stretching back 6 months, each one stamped and signed. On paper, it all looked legitimate. Too clean, maybe. Too neat. "These signatures," Danny said, tapping one of the pages. "Who processed these filings originally?" Hannah's eyes flicked toward the back office, then back to Danny. "I did." Danny studied her for a moment. The way Hannah's fingers gripped the edge of the counter a little too tight. The way her eyes kept darting toward the hallway behind her, like she expected someone to appear. "Mrs. Barson," Danny said gently, lowering her voice, "is there something you want to tell me?" Hannah's composure cracked, just slightly. She glanced around the empty lobby before leaning in closer. "I can't talk about this here." "Then where can we talk?" Hannah hesitated, chewing her bottom lip. "There's a diner 2 blocks down. I take my lunch at noon." Danny nodded slowly. "I'll be there." At noon, Danny sat across from Hannah in a corner booth of the nearly empty diner, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. Hannah kept her voice low, her eyes scanning the room every few seconds like she expected someone to walk in and catch her. "Those complaint forms," Hannah said finally, "they weren't filed 6 months ago. I filed them 3 weeks ago. Someone told me to backdate them." Danny's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Who told you to do that?" Hannah's hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "Someone from the precinct. He came in, said it was urgent county business, said the paperwork just needed to reflect an earlier filing date to match some ongoing review." She shook her head. "I didn't ask too many questions. I needed this job. Would you be willing to say that officially, in writing or in court if it came to that?" Hannah's face went pale. "I don't know. I have a family. I can't afford to lose this job over something like this." "I understand that," Danny said carefully. "But right now, my father's entire farm is at risk because of paperwork you just told me was falsified. If you come forward, it could stop this before it goes any further." Hannah stared down at her coffee for a long moment, saying nothing. "Think about it," Danny said gently. "I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I need you to know how much this matters." Hannah nodded slowly, though she didn't look convinced. Danny drove home that evening with more questions than answers swirling in her head. When she pulled into the driveway, the sun was already dipping low behind the barn. Alvin met her on the porch steps, and before she could even get out of the car fully, he told her about the unmarked sedan that had rolled slowly past the farm twice that afternoon. No plates visible, windows tinted dark. "Twice?" Danny asked, her stomach tightening. "Twice," Alvin confirmed. Slow enough that it wasn't just passing through. They sat together on the porch as darkness settled over the fields, both of them piecing together what the day had revealed. Hannah's confession. The watching car. It wasn't paranoia anymore. Somebody wanted them to know they were being watched. And the pressure, coming from every direction now, was only just beginning to close in. 3 days passed with no word from Hannah Barson, no further sightings of the unmarked sedan, and a strange, uneasy quiet that Alvin didn't trust for a second. He kept close to the house, kept Titus and Nova near, and waited for whatever was coming next. It came on a Thursday morning, in the shape of a white truck with County Animal Control painted on the side. Alvin was in the barn when he heard the tires on his gravel driveway. He stepped out, wiping his hands on his jeans, and watched a thin man in a khaki uniform climb out, clipboard in hand. The man's name tag read, DeAndre Palmer. "Alvin Arman?" Palmer asked. "That's me. I'm here regarding a complaint filed against your dogs." Palmer flipped a page on his clipboard without meeting Alvin's eyes. "Report says 2 German shepherds matching your property's description attacked a passerby on the county road 2 weeks ago." Alvin felt the blood drain from his face, replaced almost instantly by a burning heat in his chest. "That's impossible." "Sir, I'm just following up on the filed report." "There's no passerby," Alvin snapped. "There's no road traffic out here. My nearest neighbor is a mile off, and my dogs haven't left this property once in the last 2 weeks, except when I take them with me." Palmer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Titus and Nova, who had appeared from around the side of the barn, and now stood watching the exchange with quiet alertness. "I understand this is upsetting, but a formal complaint was filed. County policy requires me to serve notice of a dangerousness hearing." "By who?" Alvin demanded. "Who filed this complaint?" "I'm not able to disclose the name of the complainant." Alvin's jaw tightened so hard it ached. He didn't need a name. He already knew. The front door banged open, and Danny came striding across the yard, having heard raised voices from inside. "What's going on?" Palmer straightened, holding out his clipboard like a shield. "I'm serving formal notice for a dangerousness hearing regarding these 2 dogs. There's an allegation of an unprovoked attack." Danny snatched the clipboard before Palmer could object, scanning the paperwork fast, her eyes narrowing with every line. "This complaint has no witness statement attached. No incident report number cross-referenced with local police. No medical documentation of an alleged injury." She looked up sharply. "This is nothing. There's no evidence here at all." "I don't write the complaints, ma'am. I just serve the notices," Palmer said, taking a step back. "The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Until then, county policy states the animals may remain on premises unless deemed an immediate threat." "They are not a threat," Alvin said, his voice low and shaking with restrained fury. "They're trained. They're gentle. They've never hurt anybody who didn't deserve it." Palmer didn't respond to that. He simply handed Danny a copy of the notice, mumbled something about doing his job, and hurried back to his truck, clearly eager to be gone. Alvin stood in the driveway long after the truck disappeared down the road, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Danny stood beside him, rereading the notice for the 3rd time, her expression hard. "This is right," Alvin said. "I know it is." "I think so too," Danny said. "This complaint doesn't hold up to basic scrutiny. No witness, no evidence, filed anonymously right after the dogs stopped him from arresting you. It's retaliation. Plain and simple." "They're not taking my dogs," Alvin said, his voice breaking slightly despite his effort to hold it steady. "Danny, I trained those dogs myself. I brought them home from a war zone. I am not losing them to some made-up story. We're not going to let that happen, Danny said, though even she couldn't hide the worry pulling at the edges of her voice. I'll start building our defense today. We have 2 weeks. Alvin nodded, though his chest still felt tight, heavy with a fear he hadn't expected to feel this deeply. He'd stood his ground against armed officers without flinching. But the thought of losing Titus and Nova, of some system deciding they were dangerous based on lies typed up out of spite, scared him more than anything Wright had done so far. That evening, after Danny had gone back to her laptop and her legal pads, Alvin walked out to the porch and knelt down between his dogs. Titus leaned his head into Alvin's shoulder, and Nova pressed close against his side, both of them sensing the tension radiating off him. "They're not taking you from me," Alvin whispered, running his hands over their fur. "I promise you that. Whatever it takes." A week passed in a blur of phone calls, filings, and late nights at the kitchen table. Danny barely slept, running on coffee and determination as she built the case that would either save her father's farm and his dogs or watch it all slip away. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon. Danny's phone rang while she was reviewing property records for the 3rd time that day. It was Hannah Barson. "I've been thinking about what you said," Hannah's voice came through, quieter than before, but steadier. "About doing the right thing. I talked to my husband. He thinks I should come forward." Danny sat up straight, gripping the phone tighter. "Hannah, are you sure?" "No," Hannah admitted. "But I keep thinking about your father, about those dogs. I can't keep pretending I didn't do what I did." That afternoon, Hannah signed a sworn affidavit at Danny's kitchen table, her hand shaking as she wrote out the details of Deputy Hambrick's visit, the pressure to backdate the complaint forms, the exact date the paperwork had actually been filed. Alvin watched from across the room, feeling something in his chest loosen for the first time in days. With Hannah's affidavit secured, Danny moved fast. She filed an emergency petition with the county court the very next morning, requesting a temporary injunction to pause both the eminent domain seizure and the dangerousness hearing until an investigation could be conducted into the origin of the complaints. The judge granted it that same afternoon. Danny called Alvin from the courthouse steps, her voice bright with something close to relief. "We got it, Dad. Injunctions granted. Everything's paused, the land seizure, the hearing, all of it, pending review." Alvin sat down hard on the porch steps, the phone pressed to his ear, feeling tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of his eyes. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Danny said. "It's not over, but it's a real win." That evening, Oscar came by with a case of soda and a grin wider than Alvin had seen on him in weeks. They sat on the porch as the sun went down. Titus and Nova sprawled lazily across the steps, and for a little while, the weight that had been pressing down on Alvin's shoulders for days felt lighter than it had any right to. "Told you Marsh was worth trusting," Oscar said, raising his soda can in a mock toast. "Don't get ahead of yourself," Alvin said, though he was smiling despite his own warning. "We've got a long way to go still." "Sure," Oscar said. "But you gotta let yourself feel good sometimes, Alvin. This is good." Later that night, after Oscar had gone home and Danny had retreated to bed exhausted, Alvin received an unexpected call. It was Sheriff Marsh. "I wanted you to hear this from me directly," Marsh said. "I've started my own internal review into Wright's precinct. Quietly, for now. But what your daughter uncovered, the backdated files, the pattern with Parton Holdings, it's serious enough that I can't ignore it anymore." "I appreciate that, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet," Marsh said. "This kind of thing takes time, and Wright's not going to go down without a fight. But you should know you're not fighting this alone anymore." Alvin thanked her again before hanging up, then walked out onto the porch one last time before turning in for the night. Titus and Nova lifted their heads As he settled into the porch swing beside them, the stars scattered thick across the dark sky above the fields. For the first time since the survey stakes had appeared in his east pasture, Alvin allowed himself to believe they might actually win this. The injunction was real. Hannah's affidavit was real. Sheriff Marsh's investigation was real. He scratched behind Nova's ears, feeling her lean into his hand, and looked out at his land, silver and quiet under the moonlight. "We might just come out of this all right," he murmured, more to himself than to the dogs. But even as the words left his mouth, some small, cautious part of him refused to fully relax. Wright had promised there was more coming, and men like that didn't make promises they had no intention of keeping. 4 days after the injunction, Danny drove out to Hannah Barson's house to prepare her for formal testimony. The hearing to review the eminent domain filing was scheduled for the following week, and Danny wanted every detail locked down tight before they walked into that courtroom. She knocked on the front door, a folder of prep questions tucked under her arm, expecting the same cautious but determined woman she'd spoken to days earlier. Instead, Hannah opened the door pale and shaking, refusing to meet Danny's eyes. "Hannah? What's wrong?" "I can't do this," Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to take back what I said." Danny's stomach dropped. "Take back the affidavit? Hannah, that's sworn testimony. What happened?" Hannah glanced over her shoulder into the house, then stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. "Deputy Hambrick came by my house 2 nights ago. He didn't threaten me outright, not in so many words. But he made it very clear what could happen to my job, to my husband's job, if I testified against the department." Her hands trembled as she spoke. "He mentioned my kids' school, said it was a shame how budget cuts could affect bus routes for certain families." Danny felt a cold anger settle in her chest. "That's witness intimidation, Hannah. That's a crime." "I know that," Hannah said, tears welling in her eyes. "But I have to protect my family. I'm sorry. I can't testify anymore." Danny tried everything: reassurance, offers of protection, appeals to Hannah's own conscience, but Hannah's mind was made up. Fear had won. Danny left empty-handed, her hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home. She hadn't even made it back to the farm when her phone rang. It was the court clerk. "Ms. Armand, I'm calling to inform you that the temporary injunction on the Armand property has been overturned, effective immediately." Danny nearly swerved off the road. "Overturned? On what grounds?" The presiding judge cited procedural error in the original filing. "The case has been reassigned to Judge Charles Pierce for final review." Danny's blood ran cold. Judge Pierce. She'd seen that name before, buried in property records from one of the other counties where Parton Holdings had operated, listed as a signing authority on a rezoning application years earlier. This wasn't procedural error. This was a setup. By the time she reached the farm, her hands were still shaking with fury. She found Alvin in the yard, and the moment she opened her mouth to explain, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. The same white truck from the week before. DeAndre Palmer stepped out, this time with a second officer beside him, and a folded court order in his hand. "Mr. Armand," Palmer said, unable to look Alvin in the eye, "I have a valid court order here. Effective immediately. Your dogs are to be impounded, pending the rescheduled dangerousness hearing." "You can't do this," Alvin said, his voice breaking. "The injunction was overturned this morning," Palmer said quietly. "I'm sorry. This isn't personal. I have to comply with the order." Alvin's whole body went rigid. Titus and Nova stood beside him, sensing the tension radiating off their owner, growling low in their throats. "Please," Alvin said, "just please, don't do this." But the officers moved forward with a leash and a transport crate, and Alvin, with tears burning in his eyes, forced himself to kneel down and calm his dogs, whispering to them, telling them it would be okay, even as his own voice cracked with every word. He couldn't let them fight. He couldn't let this become the excuse Wright needed to hurt them for real. He watched, frozen, as Titus and Nova were loaded into the back of the van, their eyes locked on him through the small window, confused and afraid in a way he'd never seen from them before, not even in war zones. The van pulled away down the driveway, dust rising behind it, and Alvin stood there long after it disappeared from sight, the silence of his empty yard pressing down on him like a physical weight. Danny walked up beside him, gripping his shoulder tight, her own eyes wet with helpless fury. "We'll get them back," she said, though her voice shook with the effort of believing her own words. "I promise you, Dad, we'll get them back." Alvin said nothing. He just stared down the empty driveway, the silence where his dogs should have been unbearable, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something inside him buckle under the weight of it all. Alvin didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table long after Danny had gone to bed, staring at the empty spot by the door where Titus and Nova usually curled up at the end of the day. The silence in the house pressed down on him harder than any threat Wright had made in person. Danny hadn't slept either. Alvin heard her moving around upstairs well past midnight, and by the time the sun came up, she was already back at the kitchen table, laptop open, eyes red-rimmed but sharp, with a kind of focus that told Alvin she wasn't giving up. Not by a long shot. "I've been thinking about what you said," Danny told him, not looking up from her screen. "About the Hendersons, the Whitmore place. What about them? I want to know exactly how those sales went down. If Parton Holdings used the same playbook on them that they're using on us, that's not just harassment anymore. That's a pattern. And patterns are provable." She spent the morning digging through public records from 2 other counties, cross-referencing property transfers, court filings, and local news archives. Alvin brought her coffee and sat across from her, watching the pieces come together on her screen like a puzzle finally taking shape. "Here," Danny said finally, turning the laptop toward him. 2 years ago, a farmer named Weston Trent in the next county over. Same story. Fabricated nuisance complaints. Eminent domain filing backed by Parton Holdings. He fought it for 6 months before giving up and selling. And this one," she continued, pulling up another article. "A widow named Colleen Everhart, a different county, 3 years back. Same pattern almost exactly. Backdated complaints, a rushed court filing, local police cooperation." Alvin stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. "This isn't harassment, Danny. This is a business model." "That's exactly what it is," Danny said. "And that changes everything. This isn't a local dispute we're fighting anymore. This is a conspiracy that's crossed county lines, involving multiple police departments and at least one judge with financial ties to the same development company. That's the kind of thing that gets state investigators involved." Alvin felt something shift inside him, a flicker of the same fire that had carried him through 2 tours overseas. Fear was still there, sharp and constant, especially with Titus and Nova gone, but underneath it now sat something harder, something angrier. "What do we do with this?" he asked. "We take it straight to Sheriff Marsh," Danny said, already gathering the printed pages into a folder. "She's already investigating Wright's precinct internally. If I hand her proof that this goes beyond Wright, beyond just us, she won't be able to sit on it. Not without becoming part of the cover-up herself." Alvin nodded slowly, his hands still trembling slightly from lack of sleep and the hollow ache of missing his dogs. "And Hambrick? What he did to Hannah?" "Witness intimidation is a crime on its own," Danny said, her voice hardening. "It doesn't matter how careful he thought he was being. Threatening someone's job, their kids, their safety, That's enough to bring charges independent of everything else. She packed the folder into her bag and grabbed her keys, pausing at the door to look back at her father. He looked older than she remembered, the last few days carving lines into his face that hadn't been there before. But there was something steady in his eyes now, too, something that told her he wasn't broken. Not yet. Not while there was still a fight left to have. "I'm going to the sheriff's office right now," Danny said. "I'll call you the second I know something." "Go," Alvin said. "I'll be here." After she left, Alvin walked out to the empty dog kennels behind the barn, running his hand along the cold metal fencing where Titus and Nova should have been resting. The morning sun climbed higher over the fields, casting long shadows across the grass, and for a moment the quiet felt unbearable. "Hang on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dogs, to himself, or to the farm itself. "Just hang on a little longer." He turned back toward the house, forcing his feet to move, refusing to let himself sink into the silence any longer than he had to. There was still a fight left, and for the first time in days, Alvin believed they might actually be winning it. Danny arrived at the sheriff's office just after 10. The folder of evidence clutched tight against her chest, like something that might slip away if she loosened her grip. She didn't wait to be announced. She walked straight past the front desk toward Sheriff Marsh's office, and the deputy on duty, recognizing the urgency in her stride, didn't try to stop her. Marsh looked up from her desk, immediately setting down her pen when she saw Danny's expression. "What happened?" "Sit down," Danny said, "and give me 20 minutes. I think you're going to want to hear all of this." Marsh gestured to the chair across from her, and Danny laid out everything, starting with Weston Trent's farm, 2 counties over, then Colleen Everhart's land 3 years earlier, each case following the same exact playbook: fabricated complaints, a rushed eminent domain filing, and Parton Holdings waiting on the other end to buy up the property once the owner gave in. "This isn't just happening to my father," Danny said. "This is a pattern that spans multiple counties, multiple police departments, and at least one judge with direct financial ties to Parton Holdings." Marsh's face grew paler with every document Danny slid across the desk. She picked up the property records, comparing dates, her lips pressing into a hard line. "And this," Danny said, pulling out the final piece, "is a written statement from Hannah Barson, given before she was intimidated into silence. She names Deputy Hambrick directly, describes the threats he made against her family if she testified about the backdated complaint forms." Marsh set the paper down slowly, her jaw tight. "Witness intimidation. That's a felony on its own, regardless of everything else." "I know," Danny said. "And I know Captain Wright works under you. I know this isn't easy to hear." Marsh was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the papers spread across her desk. When she finally looked up, something had changed in her eyes. The last flicker of doubt burned away, replaced by a hard, focused resolve. "I've suspected something wasn't right in that precinct for a while now," Marsh admitted. "I just didn't have enough to act on it. This," she gestured at the folder, "this is enough. More than enough. What happens now?" "I'm requesting a state investigation immediately," Marsh said, already reaching for her phone. "This is too large for me to handle internally, and frankly, I don't trust that it hasn't already reached higher than right. State investigators will have the authority and resources to dig into Parton Holdings' finances, the judge's involvement, all of it. And the dangerousness hearing, my father's dogs. I'll be there personally," Marsh said. "I'll make sure Palmer's complaint gets the scrutiny it should have gotten from the start. No missing witness statements, no anonymous accusations standing unchallenged. If there's nothing behind that complaint, and I don't believe there is, it won't survive an honest hearing." Relief washed through Danny so suddenly it nearly buckled her knees. She'd hoped for cooperation, but she hadn't expected this kind of full, immediate commitment. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet," Marsh said, echoing words Danny had heard once before. "This is going to get uglier before it gets better. Wright's not going to go quietly, and if Parton Holdings has this kind of reach, they'll fight back hard. But I'm not going to let my department be used as a weapon against people who did nothing wrong." Danny left the sheriff's office with the first real sense of institutional support she'd felt since this nightmare began. She drove home fast, eager to share the news with her father, watching the fields blur past the window as the sun began its slow descent toward evening. Alvin was waiting on the porch when she pulled in, and the moment she stepped out of the car, she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Days without his dogs, nights without sleep, all of it catching up to him at once. "Well?" he asked. "Marsh is requesting a state investigation," Danny said, "and she's going to be at the hearing personally. She's on our side, Dad. All the way." Alvin let out a long breath, some of the tension finally draining from his shoulders. "That's good. That's real good." They sat together at the kitchen table late into the night, finalizing what evidence they'd present at the hearing scheduled in 2 days, going over every detail twice, then a third time, refusing to leave anything to chance. Outside, the night settled quiet and dark over the empty kennels, but for the first time in days, Alvin allowed himself to believe that quiet might not last much longer. Word traveled fast once Oscar Rayburn got involved. He started with a phone call to the Hendersons' old number, half expecting it to be disconnected since they'd sold their farm to Parton Holdings the year before. To his surprise, they still lived in the county, renting a small house in town after losing the land that had been in their family for 2 generations. When Oscar explained what was happening to Alvin and the pattern Danny had uncovered linking their situation to the Armin farm, there was a long silence on the line. "We always knew something wasn't right about how fast that all happened," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "We just didn't have proof, didn't have anybody to tell." "Well, now you do," Oscar said. "And there's a hearing in 2 days that could bring the whole thing out into the open." By the end of the day, Oscar had made a dozen more calls, reaching out to farmers up and down the county road, some who'd heard whispers about Alvin's trouble, others who hadn't known anything until Oscar laid it out plain and simple. Several of them, including the Hendersons, agreed to show up at the hearing in a visible show of support, a wall of neighbors standing behind Alvin when he needed it most. Meanwhile, Danny made one final trip to see Hannah Barson. She knocked on the door, unsure what kind of reception she'd get after Hannah's retraction. But Hannah answered, looking almost relieved to see her. "I heard Sheriff Marsh is involved now," Hannah said before Danny could even speak. "Is that true?" "It's true," Danny said. "She's requesting a state investigation, and she'll be at the hearing in person. If you testify now, you'd have real protection behind you, not just a promise." Hannah stood in her doorway for a long moment, twisting her hands together, clearly wrestling with the same fear that had silenced her before. "Hambrick threatened my kid's school, my husband's job." "I know," Danny said gently. "And after this comes out, that threat becomes evidence against him too. You wouldn't be alone in this anymore, Hannah. There are other families now, other people willing to stand up and say this happened to them too." Hannah's eyes glistened, and for a moment, Danny thought she might refuse again. But then something shifted in her expression, a kind of quiet resolve settling over her features. "Okay," Hannah said. "I'll testify. I'm tired of being scared." Danny thanked her, feeling a weight lift off her chest that had been sitting there since the injunction was overturned. She drove back to the farm as the sun dipped low, and when she arrived, she found Alvin standing at the fence line, watching a small but steady stream of trucks pull into Oscar's driveway next door. "What's all this?" Danny asked, walking up beside him. "Oscar has been busy," Alvin said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth for the first time in days. Says folks are coming out tomorrow night to show support before the hearing. Wants everybody arriving together, showing up as one group. Danny watched as more trucks rolled in. Farmers she recognized from around the county. Some she didn't know at all gathering at Oscar's place, talking in low, serious voices about what was coming. It wasn't just about Alvin anymore. It was about every family Parton Holdings had quietly destroyed over the years, families who'd never had the chance to fight back the way Alvin now could. Hannah's going to testify, Danny said. She called it off before, but she changed her mind. Said she's tired of being scared. Alvin nodded slowly, watching the gathering crowd next door with something like disbelief. I didn't expect this. Any of it. You spent 30 years being a good neighbor to these people, Danny said. Now, they're being won back. That evening, Alvin walked over to Oscar's yard, shaking hands with farmers he hadn't spoken to in months, listening to story after story of near misses with Parton Holdings, of aggressive land offers and strange visits from unfamiliar officials. Every conversation made the picture clearer and larger than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just his fight. It never had been. As the last of the evening light faded behind the barn, Alvin stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the trucks and the porch lights, and the quiet determination on every face around him. For the first time since Titus and Nova had been taken, he didn't feel like he was standing alone against something too big to beat. Tomorrow, they would walk into that courtroom together. The county courthouse had never seen a crowd like this. By the time Alvin arrived with Danny at his side, the benches were already filling fast with familiar faces. Oscar, the Hendersons, a dozen other farmers who'd driven in from across the county. All of them there, for one reason. Sheriff Ivory Marsh stood near the front of the gallery, arms crossed, her presence alone enough to make the room feel different. Official. Watched. At the back of the courtroom, an animal control transport crate sat near the door, and Alvin's chest tightened the moment he saw it. Titus and Nova were somewhere behind those doors, and every part of him wanted to go to them right then. Soon, Danny whispered, catching the look on his face. Just hold on a little longer. The hearing began with DeAndre Palmer presenting the original complaint, reading aloud the claim of an unprovoked attack on an unnamed passerby along the county road. Danny rose immediately for cross-examination. Officer Palmer, can you provide the name of this alleged witness? That information wasn't included in the complaint. Can you provide a police report cross-referencing this incident? A medical record showing any injury? No, ma'am. So this hearing is based entirely on an anonymous claim, with no witness, no evidence, and no supporting documentation whatsoever? Palmer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I only serve the notices, ma'am. I don't investigate the claims themselves. The judge's expression darkened as Danny let the silence hang, letting the emptiness of the complaint speak for itself. Then came Hannah Barson. She walked to the stand with her hands trembling but her voice steady, describing in detail how Deputy Hambrick had pressured her into backdating the original nuisance complaints against Alvin, and how he'd returned days later, threatening her family's livelihood if she testified. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Wright, seated near the back, shifted sharply in his chair, his face darkening with fury. Sheriff Marsh stood next, confirming that her office's independent investigation had already uncovered corroborating evidence. Falsified timestamps in the precinct's own filing system, financial records linking Wright to Parton Holdings through an intermediary account, and matching patterns from 2 other counties where identical schemes had forced farmers off their land. This isn't an isolated complaint, Marsh told the judge. This is a coordinated pattern of fraud and intimidation. Wright shot to his feet. This is a setup. These people are lying to protect their own interests. Sit down, Captain, the judge warned sharply. But it was too late. 2 state investigators, who had been waiting quietly near the courtroom entrance, stepped forward. One of them approached Hambrick directly, reading him his rights for witness tampering right there in front of the stunned gallery. Hambrick's face went white as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Wright tried to bolt for the side exit, but Sheriff Marsh moved first, blocking his path with a hard, unflinching stare. "Don't make this worse for yourself, Roland." The second investigator approached with a warrant, citing evidence, tampering, and conspiracy tied to the multi-county pattern Danny had uncovered. Wright's shoulders sagged as the cuffs went on, all his earlier bravado collapsing into stunned silence. The gallery erupted into murmurs, some of relief, some of disbelief, as both men were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The judge called for order, and once the room settled, he turned his attention back to the matter at hand. Given the complete absence of credible evidence supporting the original complaint and the clear pattern of misconduct presented here today, this court finds no basis for the dangerousness designation. He struck his gavel down. The eminent domain petition against the Arman property is hereby voided in full, effective immediately. Alvin's knees nearly buckled with relief. Beside him, Danny grabbed his arm, tears streaming freely down her face, despite her best efforts to stay composed. "And regarding the animals in question," the judge continued, glancing toward the crate at the back of the room, "release them to their owner immediately." Alvin didn't wait for permission. He was already moving, pushing past the gallery benches, his heart pounding as an animal control officer, looking almost relieved himself, opened the crate door. Titus and Nova burst out at a full run, and Alvin dropped to his knees right there in the courtroom aisle, gathering both dogs into his arms as they whined and licked at his face, their bodies trembling with the same overwhelming relief that filled his own chest. Around him, the gallery erupted into applause, farmers and neighbors rising to their feet, the sound rolling through the courtroom like something Alvin hadn't heard in weeks. Justice. The courthouse parking lot buzzed with noise as Alvin stepped outside. Titus and Nova pressed close against his legs, refusing to leave his side even for a moment. Neighbors surrounded him almost immediately, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand, some of them wiping tears from their eyes. Oscar pushed through the crowd first, wrapping Alvin in a hug so tight it nearly knocked the wind out of him. "Told you," Oscar said, his voice thick. "Told you we'd get through this." "You didn't tell me it'd end with 2 men in handcuffs," Alvin said, laughing, despite the exhaustion weighing down every muscle in his body. Sheriff Marsh approached a few minutes later, her expression serious, but softened with something like satisfaction. "The state investigation is moving fast," she told Alvin and Danny. "With what we found today, plus everything your daughter uncovered about the other counties, Wright and Hambrick are looking at charges well beyond what happened here. Fraud, witness tampering, conspiracy. And Parton Holdings is already under investigation in 2 other jurisdictions." "And Esther Parton herself?" Danny asked. "Under investigation too," Marsh confirmed. "Once one thread gets pulled on something like this, the whole thing tends to unravel fast." Alvin knelt down between Titus and Nova, running his hands over their fur, still hardly able to believe they were really there, warm and solid and safe. "It's over," he said quietly, more to them than to anyone else. "It's really over." "Not quite everything," Danny said, a small smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. "There's still paperwork to file. I want to make sure this land can never be threatened like this again." Alvin looked up at her. "What do you mean?" "A conservation easement," Danny explained. "It would permanently protect the farm from future development or seizure attempts, regardless of who's sitting in the county offices years from now. I already have the paperwork ready. All you have to do is sign." Alvin didn't hesitate. "Where do I sign?" That evening, word of what happened at the courthouse spread through the county faster than Alvin could have imagined. By the time he pulled into his own driveway, trucks were already lining the road. Farmers and neighbors gathering in his yard with coolers, folding chairs and covered dishes balanced carefully in their arms. Oscar had wasted no time organizing a celebration, and it seemed like half the county had shown up to take part in it. Alvin stood on his porch for a long moment, just watching, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Titus and Nova wove happily through the crowd, accepting scratches and pats from every direction, tails wagging non-stop. Oscar raised a soda can high above his head as the sun began sinking low behind the barn, painting the sky in streaks of gold and deep orange. "To Alvin Arman," he called out, "and to justice, finally done right." The crowd cheered, cans and cups raised high, and Alvin felt his own eyes sting with tears he didn't bother hiding any more. Danny stood beside him, her arm wrapped around his shoulders, watching the celebration with quiet pride. "You did good, Dad," she said softly. "We did good," Alvin corrected her. "Wasn't just me." As the party wound down and neighbors began heading home under a sky full of stars, Alvin finally found a quiet moment alone. He walked out past the barn, out toward the east field where the survey stakes had once cut through his land like a wound. The stakes were gone now, pulled up and thrown away days ago, leaving nothing behind but open grass swaying gently in the night breeze. Titus and Nova trotted along beside him, matching his pace, step for step, the same way they always had. Alvin walked all the way to the fence line, the same spot where Wright and Hambrick had once cornered him in the gray light of early morning, hands reaching, threats hanging thick in the air. Now the field was silent except for the wind and the soft rustle of grass. Alvin rested his hand on the old wooden fence post, feeling the familiar rough wood beneath his palm, grounding him the way it always had. This land had tried to be taken from him. Lies had been told. Threats had been made. His dogs had been ripped away from him, and for one terrible night he'd stood in an empty yard, wondering if any of it would ever be made right again. But it had. Because he'd refused to stand alone, and because good people, when given the chance, chose to stand beside him instead of looking away. Titus leaned against his leg, and Nova settled at his feet, both of them calm now, alert but unafraid, exactly the way they were meant to be. Alvin looked out over his fields one last time before heading back toward the house, the stars bright overhead, his land finally, fully his own. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.